Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Sydney Watts is Associate Professor at the University of Richmond. Sydney, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you're researching and writing about at the moment?
Well, I'm working on a book project that focuses on the Channel Islands, which are an archipelago off the British coast and actually quite close to the French northern coastline. I'm interested in the migration of refugees and French immigrants, basically from the French Revolution and that period that lasted into the Napoleonic Wars even. So there's a lot of movement between France and the Channel Islands and the Channel Islands in Britain. And I've discovered also a lot of movement across the Atlantic. And so that's what brought me to the Hagley Museum and Library, because I was very interested in the DuPont papers, which have records from their migration and their departure from France, which was in a later period of the Revolution, actually under the Directory. So it was interesting to read how they left and who they took with them and what they did when they arrived and their memories of France once they were in the United States and their settlement in Delaware.
Sounds like a really interesting project. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about the Channel Islands? I understand there's Jersey and Guernsey, but beyond that, it's sort of a blank page for me.
Well, those are the primary islands. Those are the two largest, and they're not very big. Yeah, I think in a total, it's, probably, gosh, I should know this, but it's like 80 or 90 square kilometers on each island.
Mhm.
So that you can drive around the island in a matter of an hour or two, it's very easy to get around. But during the 18th century, it wasn't like that at all. It was very hard to get to. And it required certainly a well-traveled navigator, a pilot who could get you through the shallow waters and the tidal shifts and the storms at times, which were quite treacherous. So it was a place of refuge for a lot of expatriates and people who were leaving France for political reasons, for some economic reasons, but most often it was a place for some famous writers like Victor Hugo to live. And he lived on both islands, Guernsey and Jersey, and spent a lot of his life writing his great tome, which was Les Miserables. So that was, important place for the French. And it had an interesting cultural aspect in the 18th century. They were still speaking French, Norman French. And the British thought of them as kind of less English than French. And
Mhm.
the Channel Islanders thought of the English as foreigners. So there's a kind of interesting borderland community there, which was really my approach to this project is to see how these borderlands, particularly Jersey and Guernsey, and to some extent Alderney and Sark, which are the tiny little islands that
Hmm.
are included in the Channel Islands, not as well populated, but important strategically because they did offer a great kind of barrier to invasion from France. And during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, there was always the fear that the French were going to invade, and first landing would be on the Channel Islands.
So during this period, the Channel Islands were controlled by Britain, is that correct?
They were. And that's an interesting story because they were considered one of their protectorates, um, but the Channel Islands themselves, they saw themselves as quite independent, and they had their own states of Jersey and states of Guernsey, their own local government. And the governors who came to, and very infrequently came to the islands, they usually sent a lieutenant governor who was stationed on the island. They had trouble managing the local populations at times because they were so fiercely independent and didn't always abide by the navigation acts, for example. They had special privileges that allowed them to operate outside of the Admiralty's purview. And so there was a great deal of smuggling, and privateering was also part of their history. Of course, they did that in the name of Britain, but they also benefited commercially from commerce raiding. And so so their interest in the maritime trades is really important, and that's what brought them across the Atlantic. And I actually found, this is a wonderful discovery when I was at the Hagley Museum and Library, was the records of Victor Dupont. When he was traveling extensively in 1793, he landed in the Channel Islands. And so I was really thrilled to see that, but not surprised because so many people who crossed the Atlantic heading to northern route, they would pass by Ireland, and often they would land in Guernsey. It was kind of a natural pathway into the North Sea, and he was very interested in different kinds of commercial links between the North Sea and the United States, and certainly trying to build more diplomatic ties, which were important as a French diplomat in the Americas with, at this point in the Atlantic world, a lot of connections between shippers, merchants, and, you know, different kinds of naval agreements over fishing rights. The war on commerce was really active during this time. So there were a lot of interesting proposals on his part to try and see where the United States, at this point, very young country, and a lot of privateers because they didn't have a navy, but how they might work with the French. And, this was a time when Britain was the great enemy. So the Channel Islands kind of present an interesting case study because while I didn't discover any direct links beyond the fact that he visited briefly there, um, a lot of French people and French merchants were active in trade with the Channel Islands. And there was a lot of contraband, obviously, during that time, time of war. And the Channel Island merchants and privateers were also quite active in making sure the French were not gaining too far ahead, but they would still do a number of trades with them in contraband, so tobacco, wine, brandy, those kinds of things.
Mhm. Well, it seems like the Channel Islands is a borderland in more than one sense. It's a boundary between Britain and France, but it also seems to be very much a vector within the circulation of the greater Atlantic world and a boundary within those patterns of circulation. Am I onto something there?
Yes, you are. Yeah, in fact, I'm continuing this research, excuse me, into Canada. And that's
Hmm.
where I'm discovering a lot of fisheries that were founded by Jersey fishermen. And the merchants there were quite successful. In fact, after the French left in 1783. And that's where you really see a shift in not only the properties of merchant fishermen, but also a lot of commerce raiding, and the Americans were also quite active in trying to capture ships full of salt cod, which is kind of the gold mine of the North Atlantic, particularly in the northern regions of the North Atlantic. So these ships would be raided, and the cargo would be taken. But, the Jersey and Guernsey fishermen, full of these cargoes would drop them off in the West Indies and then even sail down as far as the Caribbean ports in Honduras to pick up timber and other items to bring back to the Channel Islands to build more boats. And so there was quite a trade going on. And, one thing that was often disputed was, of course, fishing rights, because during this time when the French had lost after what we call the French and Indian War, what they call the 7 Years' War, they had lost a lot of their territories in the Quebec province. And so the English were trying to reassert themselves, and it was really the Channel Islanders who were trying to take these lands and these fishing areas from the French. But the Americans were also very interested in them. And so in the records of Victor Dupont and uh, Pierre Samuel Dupont, I found some references to negotiations that were happening over fishing rights, which was quite important during that time. And so, yeah, President Adams was really involved in this. And you'd never think that, fishing rights were so vital, but it was a really important interest to the United States to try and secure some of those rights.
Mhm. Oh, no, where does the refugee story come in, and the sort of story of the Channel Islands as an important stopping ground and perhaps even refuge for these folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really where I started this project because I had found a number of passports for French families, essentially, who
Hmm.
were leaving from Brittany and Normandy, the northern coast of France, to the Channel Islands. And it's a rare set of documents that actually we don't know much about the migration of refugees during this time, but there was a terrific collection of basically alien records. This is the Aliens Act during the 1793 period when the escalation of war was and the French Revolution was becoming more radicalized. A lot of people were leaving, and they chose the Channel Islands because its proximity. Certainly, it's very close. You could almost row a boat to it on still waters. You had to be careful. But it was actually a place where a large number, up to 4,000 refugees landed in a period of about 10 years. They stayed there. And there were a number of funds provided for them, first raised by private interests in Britain, but later the state supplied a fund for French refugees, and that actually drew a lot more people. In fact, we think of the immigration like the DuPonts as, led by these nobles who basically lost out on the French Revolution. And certainly there were many like that on the island. But there were also a large number of commoners who left because of the threat of civil war and the conflicts on the continent. And they found a very secure life and a kind of subsidy that allowed them to survive and thrive in many cases. So the island of Jersey was the real epicenter of the refugee population, more than Guernsey. And Jersey became um, a kind of refugee center for French immigrants. And these were not just, as I said, not just nobles, but they were also commoners, some of whom were farmers, some of whom were skilled tradesmen, I should say. And then others were widows and women traveling alone, very old people, the elderly arrived, and young children. There were even a few cases of orphans coming over, a number of priests who were basically exiled after
Mhm.
they refused to give the oath to the civil constitution of the clergy. They arrived as well in large numbers. So there's a really interesting population of French Catholics in a Protestant um, country, an island, part of Great Britain. But the ways in which those funds were provided really showed how Britain wanted to demonstrate its its support for these populations. And locally, it's a little different. It's the
Hmm.
story was, a little, it had a little more conflict there. So I've uncovered some of that as well. And, the stories between the local parish rector who is a little uncomfortable with the kind of proselytizing of certain priests who are baptizing and marrying people. And there were, over a course of 10 years, there were families who grew, who became more settled, and some of them went on to other places in Britain. Some of them sailed off to the Americas. So there's an interesting story, again, of migration that really is the theme of the book. One thing that I was really interested in when I was doing my work at the DuPont, with the DuPont records, was the stories of uh, different kinds of domestic servants,
Hmm.
women and men. And there's a kind of a range here, but governesses, ladies in waiting, nurses, washerwomen, people cooks, different kinds of work that was part of the domestic service industry. They migrated in large numbers too. And a lot of them lost their jobs because the
Hmm.
nobles and the wealthy had basically been driven from the country or exiled, or simply, the economic situation had resulted in their being let go. So this economic migration is kind of interesting. And the DuPonts themselves wanted to make sure that some of these governesses and domestic servants of their household made it to the United States, which I thought was
Hmm.
quite interesting. So yeah, Madame Rivardi is one of them. She was a governess who started a school in the area, and she educated some of the children, the daughters of Victor, and so another was Madame Chotard, who was actually on the American Eagle, which was part of their migration, the ship that brought them to the United States. So yeah, so you see how households really are trying to hang together with their domestic servants who, really had very little independence of their own. They were dependent upon the generosity of these families, and
Hmm.
essentially non-kin members of a household. So yeah, so this kind of story hasn't really been told either, and I think that's an important part of it, is how we see refugee migration today is very different than in the 18th century, where households were really trying to maintain some kind of cohesion. um, yeah, and that was an important
Hmm.
part of the story for them.
Hmm. I wonder how the DuPont records at the Hagley Library came on your radar.
Well, they've always been on my radar. I just haven't always found a way into, a particular line of inquiry that I felt would really benefit, because, there are a lot of French historians who've done wonderful work at the Hagley, and I didn't want to repeat what they've done. I think in my case, it was really finding um, a story that connected this idea of migration and the Channel Islands to the particular lives of um, Victor Dupont, for sure, Pierre Samuel, their wives, their children. Their memories of France is also really interesting, how they
Mm.
remember it. But for an American who studies French history and Atlantic world, I think this collection is terrific because it has so many letters, and we don't often get those in the archives. They're often lost, and these are so well preserved and so fairly well organized, so that you can really dig into a set of correspondence that is, you get both sides to the correspondence, which doesn't always happen either. Letters to and letters from. And so it's really nice to build an understanding of the lives and the inner thoughts, the kind of we call the intimate life of these people and how they reflect on being French and being in America. And I think I was really fortunate in many ways because my residency coincided with another scholar, Rebecca Jeffrey Schwinden, who's been there for the entire year. And she and I were reading the same documents with very different questions, though.
Hmm.
And so it was so fun to talk to her at the end of the day. We were both in residence together and sharing the same house, the blacksmith shop. And so we'd have dinner together. We'd talk about what we had read that day. And it was just fantastic. And I really appreciated having that time with Rebecca. And I really hope that we can continue our collaboration because I think that's so valuable. But I think the more that French historians know about these archives, I think the better. And I've talked with several historians who've pointed me in this direction. So I know that they are aware of it, but I think we tend to think, oh, you have to go to France to find this stuff. But you don't. You don't have to, which
Hmm.
is really nice.
Hmm. I think it's quite interesting to consider the DuPonts as refugees. We often, in scholarship as well as sort of in the popular memory of the DuPont story, consider them as more entrepreneurial, having looking for opportunities in the new world, so to speak, and less fleeing difficulties in the old world. Although that's, as you point out, very much part of the story. I'm wondering what the DuPonts' memories of France were like, whether they were positive or negative, and how they were reflecting on that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the DuPonts, because they left in a later era, they had in some ways less of a refugee experience than much more of a kind of the entrepreneurial experience, right? Of venturing out and certainly Pierre Samuel's efforts to create a company that of investors to try and find a way to make it work financially was really part of his plan from the beginning. And it had the consent of the French government. He was not like a lot of these other refugees that came to Jersey who were really escaping without sometimes any passport in the dark of night, right? They were trying to slip out without being noticed. Um, so their experience is quite different. And to call them refugees, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, but I guess I would say too that when I look at some of their reflections on this and the considerations of my time in France. Those are writings that become very nostalgic, and
Mm.
I think too, and I'm borrowing a lot from Rebecca's work on this is really trying to recreate an experience that was something they had in the Ancien regime in France, right? In a period of time when a kind of a noble life was very charmed and very privileged, and the harshness of the climate in Delaware, it's a little something they had to get used to. Of course, they didn't really like New York. They went a little further south, but finding a place where they could really settle and recreate some kind of haven is important
Mm.
for the women especially, and I think that's what touched me the most. And also just having the right servants. I mean, this was one of the letters that I was really taken by too, is, a mother's advice to her daughter about really making sure you have the right servants. And that again comes from a kind of noblesse oblige, they call it, this idea that you build a home where you show a kind of generosity to the commoner class and you're benefiting them by bringing them into your family and providing them a means to sustain themselves, but they are your dependents and you are their patron. And those patron-client relations are extremely important in the 18th century because there was very little to protect people from falling into poverty and falling into, a real financial ruin. And I think the DuPonts understood this, but I think also some of the women really felt like they were still in this privileged place where they hung on to these customs and certainly these ways of living that they tried to replicate in Delaware. And it's beautiful. I mean, it's really quite striking when you think about how that persisted over time. I'm visiting some of their estates and the gardens and things like that. I think that you really see it, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Now, what might you say to a scholar who is considering conducting research at Hagley?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would say definitely get an exploratory grant because that's what helped me so much. I think once I spent a week, really moving through a number of finding aids, starting out with just a few of the records that I felt seemed interesting. Once I started digging in, I realized how much was there. I could write a much better grant proposal. And even then, there was so much more that I found once I arrived. But I think the exploratory grant's really important. I think that's a good starting point. I also think conversations with other scholars really helped me. People who had used the resources at the Hagley had given me a lot of great pointers and things to consider. But I really think it's just such a wonderful opportunity, and it's a very welcoming environment. And the way it's set up, I think it's really unique in a lot of ways. There aren't many residencies like this for especially for European historians who live in the United States. So, I think there's a lot of opportunity to really think broadly about aspects of certainly business history, but also, the cultural histories of French immigrants, and I think that's very interesting.
Well, Cindy, thank you so much for speaking with me today. It's just been great.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, you're very welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's Hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.